Welcome to Philosophy15. I'm Scott Aiken.
I'm Robert Talese.
We are the authors of Political Argument in a Polarized Age and Why We Argue and How We Should in second edition from Rutledge. Today, oh hey, by the way, welcome back. It's been like forever.
Yeah, at least, 16 months?
Yeah, that's an eternity to profs who normally talk to each other. But here we are back in the office, recording videos. Today, we're going to talk about a puzzle, a dilemma that Rob has been thinking about called the Democrat's Dilemma. Rob, what's the Democrat's Dilemma?
Well, so first thing to note is that the Democrat's Dilemma is not the capital D Democrat's Dilemma. So it's not a dilemma simply for affiliates of the Democratic Party.
Nancy Pelosi has a dilemma,
no, right?
But not anybody in the Republican Party.
Right.
You get away from the dilemma by being a Republican.
It's little d dilemma, little d Democrat dilemma, in that it's a dilemma for Democratic citizens, regardless of their political affiliation.
Okay.
And the dilemma runs like this. So it seems, I would say, non-controversial to think that the office of democratic citizenship, the status of being a citizen, commits us as individually to what we might think of as two kinds of requirements or two kinds of obligation with respect to politics. First, we might say there's a responsibility for, right? That is that as democratic citizens, we have an obligation to be responsible for the shape of the political world that we, as democratic citizens, play some role in authoring. So part of what we're required to do as democratic citizens is be participants, is to be reflective, is to think about the political questions of the time and the policy issues of the day in ways that reflect some kind of subtlety about things like justice and freedom and dignity and all the rest. So it looks as if, on the one hand, we are required as democratic citizens to take responsibility for politics. And the directive that falls out of that, let's just say very generally, is that taking responsibility for politics really has the flavor of this sort of like seek justice, try to see justice get done, or at least try to see injustice minimized or mitigated, or if possible, eliminated, insofar as you're able, according to your own best judgment.
So that first part is you might call it the kratia, the kratia element of democracy. You have demos and kratia.
Right.
And so that's the use your power for good
That's right.
part.
That's right.
Okay, use your power for good part of democracy. That's the first part.
But here's the demos part, right?
Here's the demos part.
Democratic citizenship also involves a responsibility to, right? So we've got responsibility for, that's the kratia part. We also have a responsibility to other citizens, because
the demos part.
because right, democracy is self-government among political equals, and so you're the co-author of the political world, but your co-authors are not only people who get to contribute their part to the political world, they contribute their part to the political world as your equals. And so what that means is that you owe them some degree of, let's just say, regard for their equality. That is, in a democracy, no one is, politically speaking, another's subordinate or boss, or inferior or toady. Now, people might play these roles, not denying that. But from the point of view of democratic citizenship, no one is assigned to them. No one
doesn't enforce those roles.
Consigned to them.
Yeah.
So we are political equals. And what that means is that we need to engage in the activities of democracy in a way that demonstrates to one another our regard for one another's equal standing. That's responsibility too. Now that might mean that you have to show a certain kind of tolerance for others, even when they disagree. That might mean that you have to listen to what some others say. That might mean that you have to be open-minded. I mean, we can talk, if you want, about what the actual obligations are that follow out of the responsibility to others. But whatever story you want to tell about the kinds of actions that are required by responsibility for and responsibility to in democratic citizenship, I think you'll still get the dilemma I have in mind.
So far we've got, because it sounds like we've got just a problem of simple disagreement, maybe, or you might say a problem of coordination, where it's like, look, have you heard of any of these sort of cases where it's like, yeah, democracy is the worst group participation project I've ever been involved in, and things like that. Yeah. But it's not that. It's not just the fact that like you've just got intransigent others or folks who aren't responsible.
That's right.
Whenever it comes to what they're supposed to do.
That's right. We can assume, for the purposes of setting up this dilemma, that everybody is doing what they should be doing.
Everyone's doing what they should be doing. So it's not just that you've got like folks who just don't take responsibility for their part of the kratia.
You can say that, public ignorance is not a major problem. People are participating. People are engaging, and they're reflective. You could say all that and still get the dilemma.
Still get the problem.
The dilemma is this. When the stakes are high and the chips are down, your responsibility in democracy tells you, do what you can to see justice happen.
Stand up for justice.
Stand up for justice.
Okay. And exercise your power to do that.
That's right.
And make sure that political power is exercised to do justice.
Here's the dilemma, though.
Okay.
When you've got people freely exercising their faculties, freely reflecting on complex questions about politics and policy, thinking seriously even about justice as a concept, you'll get disagreement across a sort of broad range of views. And so it looks as if democracy places us in the following morally compromised posture. I have to treat him as my equal, despite the fact that my best judgment tells me that he is an agent of injustice.
Because the disagreements aren't just about like how to do justice.
That's right.
The disagreements are substantive disagreements about what justice is, what counts as justice, whether or not this instance or whether or not it's contrary.
That's right. Just. And it doesn't even, when we think these thoughts, we automatically start thinking about fellow citizens who are on the fringe of democracy. We start thinking about people who aren't really on board with democracy. That's telling. Now, those people are problems, right? We got to figure out what to say to the people who are internal anti-democratic agents. But you don't need to look at the people on the fringes of democratic commitment to make this point. I think the tax rate should be X. Scott here thinks the tax rate should be X minus 4. I have to think. He's got a view about taxation that's inconsistent with justice. If he gets his way, justice will be set back. Justice will fail.
And you have participated in bringing it about. And you, by participating in that process and in following the law, because it looks like you're bound by that, given your other commitments to the demos.
That's right.
Other, you might say, procedural justice. You end up being committed to certain kinds of substantive injustice.
That's right. So that's a standing problem of democratic legitimacy, right?
That's right.
I know what justice requires. Everybody else around me is mistaken about what justice requires. Democratic processes produce the wrong outcome from my point of view, but yet I have to abide by them. But no, in this case...
So let's make sure that this dilemma is just not a restatement of the substantive versus procedural justice
puzzle. That's right.
Okay.
So here's how
clarifying.
Good. So here's one way to sort of sharpen the dilemma. Here's the conflicted stance. I'm supposed to do what I can to see justice done, to serve justice as a democratic citizen. And I have to treat Scott, my fellow citizen, who's wrong about justice, as my equal, which means I have to recognize that he is deserving of an equal say, that he is entitled to make his case, I might have an obligation up to a certain point to listen and think and talk and deliberate with him about the issues. However, when the chips are down and the stakes are high, it's hard to shake the feeling that recognizing this guy as my equal concedes something to him, assists injustice.
That's exactly it.
Right?
Right.
That in recognizing that you're my equal, in treating you in ways that,
Treating me as a moral equal.
Manifest your equality,
Yeah.
I'm being concessive to injustice. So it looks as if the responsibility to my fellow citizens pulls in a direction that counteracts my responsibility for, right, the politics. That's the Democrats' dilemma. It is formulable under all of the most favorable assumptions about what democratic citizens are like, what their capacities are, and how they are participating. And
maybe the reasons why democracy is necessary to begin with, which is the simple fact of disagreement to begin with, which is that, like, look, if we didn't have disagreement, we wouldn't need democracy or politics to begin with.
Right. Now,
so
good.
That's an important thing to note, which is that if we just said, look, if we could somehow mitigate or find a way through, or make these issues were ones where we had really no cases of negligent disagreements, a lot of these problems would dissipate, and a lot of the problems of political philosophy would dissipate, but particularly democracy. So democracy has to start with those conditions. So that's an important concession or qualification that has to be made here.
Good. And it shows, I think, from the point of view of the political psychology, why in real-world democratic contexts, when we are confronted with political questions that we regard as high stakes or normatively really salient and important, we're inclined to see all of the opposition as failing at democracy.
Right.
Right? Now, note,
instances of not just moral negligence, but a kind of democratic negligence.
That they are not really on board with democracy after all. They are enemies of democracy. Yep. They're not democratic citizens who are my equals, but who nonetheless have mistaken, depraved views about justice. They are, because of their mistaken views, we write them off. We say that they're beyond the pale of democratic citizenship. Now, note, some people watching this might be like, well, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
That's right.
The list is pretty long, right?
That's right. But notice how fundamentally anti-democratic that
thought
disposition is.
That thought itself is anti-democratic.
Right. Before you know it, right, here's we might say the kind of slope that the Democrats' dilemma kind of puts us on. Before you know it, it starts looking as if the attitude that the Democrats' dilemma encourages in us is that democracy is possible only among people who agree about fundamental normative matters.
But that eliminates the necessity for democracy.
Is there a more fundamentally non-democratic thought than the thought that... So it's kind of...
We all have to agree so that then we can have...
Democracy's great for people who are just like me, is a kind of reductio, right? I mean, so that's the dilemma. And it's, I think, given short shrift in most democratic theory. Note, a lot of the deliberative democratic theory just treats this pulling apart of responsibility to and responsibility for as symptomatic or maybe constitutive of like the failure of, we're not sufficiently democratic if these two modes of political responsibility pull apart. That strikes me as utopian and Pollyannish. The thought is that if people were really thinking, if people were really talking, you wouldn't have these two things pull apart. I think it's given short shrift, and I also think that democratic theorists who do address it sometimes just say things like, look, the dilemma is nonsense. Here's the reason why. How do I stop this?
How does I stop this crazy thing?
Last point. Maybe we'll do another one on this. The dilemma is nuts. Is ill-formed. Here's the reason why. it is a requirement of justice to treat your fellow citizens as your equals. So the responsibility for, right, removes or relieves or settles the tension that arises with responsibility too. I don't think that that's that's a little bit too tidy, let's put it that way, a solution to the dilemma. And I think it overlooks the relevant respects in which the dilemma has more to do with the political psychology of the democratic citizen than any of the sort of principled stuff.
So let's do another episode. We'll have a second episode on this. We'll answer this question as to how that's different. And then I've got a question, you might say internal to a liberal tradition on
Great.
This one. Okay.
Sounds good. Philosophy 15, folks.